Hi, I don't know how to do an intro, so I'm just going to start. Today I'm going to be talking about the prison crisis in England and how this has affected the lives of the inmates and staff hugely. The prison crisis can be blamed on government funding being inadequate. Also, outside of money, it is attitudes towards the people inside and what general society feel those inmates deserve, with the Prime Minister supporting longer sentences whilst cutting mental health support and general funding. Also, privatisation of prisons sees locking people up as a money-making scheme. I'll be making other videos on attitudes towards inmates and also one on the privatisation of prisons, so do be sure to watch them if you'd like to know more about that. So, let's get started with today's video about the prison crisis. I'm going to begin by going through some facts about the UK's prison system that display that things aren't as we'd hope for them to be with a system that is supposed to rehabilitate offenders. Reconviction rates are currently above 50%. That means that more than half of the people that enter the system end up coming back again. I think this statistic alone could show you that the rehabilitation aspect is simply not working. Levels of prisoner-on-prisoner assaults are at record highs. When statistics like this go up, it is a reflection of the system that they're in. I don't mean to say that the assaults are on the prison, not the inmates entirely, but if people are in poor conditions with bad mental health, there will be more altercations because, simply put, people aren't happy. Most prisons in the UK are Victorian buildings, so they aren't built to accommodate huge amounts of people, and the security is outdated. This means that new prisons are being built to meet the demand. Victorian prisons cost a lot to uphold and maintain the actual building, let alone the people inside of it. The prison population has grown hugely in the past 40 years. In 1980, there were approximately 42,000 offenders in custody. By 2018, there was 84,000. That's exactly doubled in 40 years. This means the facilities aren't built for this huge amount of people. It's worth noting that crime rates haven't risen significantly during that time. They've actually dropped in many categories. The fact that there is more people in prisons is down to an introduction of tougher laws and longer sentences. People are staying in prison far longer than they used to, which is taking up a lot of space. There are currently 121 prisons in England and Wales, 10 of which are women's prisons, 14 are owned privately. As I said, I'll be going into privatisation of prisons in another video, but for now it's just worth noting that the training for private prisons is done in-house, so the staff are learning on the job. Which brings me to my next point. Assaults on staff have risen by 143% in 4 years. In the year of 2017, there were 7,437 assaults on staff. 790 of those were classed as serious. That's a huge amount of assaults. This shows us that there's faults in the staff training, faults with security, and faults with a lack of staff. Due to the difficulty of the job and the poor pay to not promote interest in the career, there is not enough staff in prisons. Because of the strain the work puts on the staff, absentee days for prison staff are very high, often leaving prisons seriously understaffed. In the year up to September 2017, 300 prisoners died in custody. 190 of those were believed to be of natural causes, and 77 of these deaths were suicide. That means a quarter of deaths in prison that year was suicide. Suicide is unfortunately very common in prisons at the moment, but still the access to mental health work is sparse. Some prisons with hundreds of people will only have one mental health worker, which means they're extremely hard to see. With the way prisons are going, this number is only going to rise in the coming years. I believe that work for these issues needs to start before the prison service. Teach kids in schools coping mechanisms. Teach boys that it's okay to cry and it's okay to feel sad, and teach everyone it's okay to ask for help. These things could help people get through the hard times with each other, but ultimately the government needs to take mental health care more seriously, in and outside of prison. Funding services like these are so vital for all communities and individuals. 26% of prison population are Black, Asian, or from minority ethnic groups. That number is 3 times the representation in general public. This shows huge disparities in equality throughout the criminal justice system and the structure of our society in the UK. Police targeting of people of colour results in more people of colour being dropped into the system. More media coverage of people of colour entering the system helps to uplift the racist agendas. Like many of these issues, problems are deep-rooted into society, and the plant grows problematic stems like these. Instead of tending to the stems, we need to rip the plant out of the ground and plant a new one. This won't be done with oppressive systems that target people of colour. Newspapers that demonise, dehumanise and vilify need to go. Racism courses need to be taken by school teachers and in schools. Companies need to show that they're actively uplifting the black community. Racists need to stop being allowed to run countries full of people that they don't care about. So, much more needs to be done to get us out of a situation like this where the amount of people of colour in prison is 3 times that of the general population. The fastest growing age group in the UK's prison population is over 60s. This is because of longer sentences keeping people there until they're older. This puts strain on the staff and costs more money due to health conditions that come with age. On entry to prison, 30% of prisoners have been assessed as having a learning disability or difficulty. This means that a large percent of inmates have trouble reading prison information, filling in forms and making themselves understood. This causes difficulties. Obviously, if you struggle to understand important prison forms and information, it would make you feel stressed because your life is in the hands of this system. Stress obviously then causes many issues in turn. Not paying attention to these facts means that the appropriate help isn't offered to those that might struggle. I have more statistics about inmates and the factors that lead them to committing crime in the first place, but I'm going to save them to focus on them further in my video about changing perceptions of inmates. Watch that if you're interested in finding out more about it. So, these are some facts that have impacted the prison crisis in the UK, but the biggest problems within the service are issues at the top of the system that trickle down into many other smaller problems. The main culprits are overcrowding and underfunding. Overcrowding puts staff at risk. Officers have to be responsible for more people than they should be. It also seriously impacts the daily routine of the prison. Some prisons regularly house 160 to 180% over their certified capacity. Often there isn't enough staff to securely let offenders out of their cells for long. This means prisoners are stuck in their cells for most of the day, which has a bad impact on mental health and also destroys opportunities to access education. Because inmates can't get out of their cells to go to educational courses, they're not able to receive qualifications during their stay, which seriously negatively impacts people on release. If people have received an education on the inside, they're much more likely to not reoffend because they will have new opportunities for work. I'm going to be making a video about leaving prison, so I'll look into more aspects of what can help people to not return to prison in that video. So, due to overcrowding, staff have to focus more on physical security rather than rehabilitation. Prison rules label a cell just as a place to sleep, but the reality is, in overcrowded wings, people spend up to 23 hours a day in their cells. Because there's so many people, often there will be 2 people sharing a space that was made for 1 person, so the conditions are poorer. Cells can be especially unsanitary when overcrowded. Sometimes they have shared unscreened toilets and a lack of washing and showering facilities, which has big impacts on physical health. The concept of less eligibility is the belief that prison conditions should be poor in order to act as a deterrent. People believe that if prisons are too nice, then people will actually want to be there. But to me, this theory doesn't make sense because, as we can see in countries that have much nicer prisons than those of the UK, the crime rates are actually lower. For example, Norway. They have 60 people in prison for every 100,000 people in the population. Compare that to the UK, who has 172 people in prison for every 100,000 people. So, that shows the conditions of prison being nicer doesn't promote crime. Being stuck in a cell with nothing to do for 23 hours a day is often a temptation to do drugs, as this passes time and keeps people entertained. So drug use is more likely in overcrowded prisons, which brings up many more issues with mental and physical health and security. Drugs in prisons are a huge problem. There's issues with prescription drugs and illicit drugs, such as spice, cocaine, heroin, and black mamba. Drug issues have created problems with HIV spreading through sharing needles and hepatitis spreading because of dirty needles. Widespread health issues put a strain on the National Health Service and the prison service. Drugs inside create issues with poor behaviour and it produces violence. This comes in 2 ways. One is violence created by the altered state of the mind when intoxicated, and the other is through the hierarchy that's produced through the selling of drugs. Violence will be instigated if someone needs to pay for their drugs or if someone is trying to sell a drug that another inmate sells. This isn't even exclusively a fact that applies to inside prison. Communities that see a lot of drug use will have higher crime rates. In fact, drugs are one of the main things that promotes crime. More than half of the prison population have issues with drugs on entry. 2/3 of inmates report using Class A drugs, and 1/5 of inmates report drinking every day for at least 4 weeks leading up to their entry to prison. One way that the UK's prison service is trying to tackle the problem is through providing counsellors for those that test positive for drugs or self-refer. This counselling service offers guidance and support to those that have problems with drugs. The treatment can range from helping people to stop taking the drugs altogether or reducing the amount somebody is taking, or it can even be drug replacement programs. These services are vital within our prisons, but due to the fact that so many inmates have problems with drugs, the services are stretched and people often have to wait a long time before it's their turn to have treatment. I think that the fact so many people volunteer themselves for these programs just goes to show there is a huge willingness to change from the inmates. People want the opportunity to get better and to change their lives around. If this support was more readily available in the community, imagine how many people we could prevent from even getting to the stage that they're in prison. You might think that it's crazy how prisons have such a high volume of drugs circulating when there's such tight security, but people are inventive, so there's many ways that they can get in. One way is very simple. People come to the outside of the prison and they throw them over the walls. With technology evolving, this brings more ways of getting drugs inside. There's now problems with people using drones to deliver drugs to inmates. More old-fashioned ways are by visitors. People exchange drugs in visiting rooms through handshakes, kisses, gifts, and even sometimes hiding it in the clothes of their children or babies. Other ways include staff. Staff may be paid or threatened into bringing drugs in, or sometimes drugs can be soaked into paper and sent through the post. And lastly, inmates themselves bring them in when they first come into prison. This is because in the UK, routine strip searches on entry to prison are not conducted. I feel like I just said drugs about 1,000,000 times. So, the prison service has come up with a nifty plan to reduce the amount of drugs there are in prison. There's 3 steps: reduce supply, reduce demand, and reduce harm. Reduced supply consists of things like putting up netting around walls of prisons so that when people throw drugs over the walls, they get caught in the nets and don't make it down to the yard. They also put barriers up near windows to stop drones. They increase foot patrols, which means that the officers go around and check on cells more often. They bring drug sniffer dogs into prisons, install CCTV and drug detection services, and so on. Reduce demand. This consists of courses for drug awareness education. They also have AA groups in prisons and the counselling I mentioned earlier. These are all very effective ways of reducing the demand for drugs and having a more people-focused approach to changing perceptions and therefore ways of life. And lastly, they reduce harm. Reducing harm consists of programs that help people to reduce their intake of drugs or to switch to less harmful drugs in an ongoing process of weaning off. Another productive way of reducing harm is prisons make disinfectant for needles available and prisoners can collect it anonymously, so this helps a lot with reducing the spread of illnesses as a result of drug taking. Prisons do conduct drug tests, but often these tests are not very reliable and they're also routine, so often inmates will know when their next one is due and they will take a short break from drugs to allow them to leave their system. Okay, now I actually have said drugs too many times. In conclusion, there is a crisis going on in our prison system and it will continue to destroy the lives of those inside and the families and communities connected to them until the funding is provided to offer enough support and guidance. Ideally, the support would be readily available in our communities and schools so that people don't have to get to the point in their lives where prison is the only thing that can help them. If the people in power cared for the lives of those in situations of poverty, abuse, poor education and addiction, things would be wildly different. I'll be exploring more of this in a video I've got coming about changing perceptions of inmates, so watch that if you want to look into it more with me. Thank you for sticking with me if you're still here. I know this stuff is hefty, so I really appreciate anybody taking an interest. We need to focus on these issues if we want to see a change in our communities through the promotion of equality. Thank you for watching. Bye. For example, Norway. For examway. Norway and example. Examway. Sounds like example. I'm talking to myself. Enough talking to myself. That's actually what this whole video is. It's just me talking to myself.